So one tool in your toolkit is clear and simple language. We've already talked about how children with autism have difficulties with communication. So these are some top tips for how you can make sure your communication with your child is clear and simple to stand them in the best stead of understanding you. So the first few tips, so keep it short, clear and simple. Less is more. It's a lot easier to make your language too simple for the child, because they will always understand, than it is to make it too complicated and then you're already on the back foot and your child's having to work really hard to make sense of what you say. It's really important to make sure you're careful with the child's literal interpretation. So try and avoid jokes and sarcasm and these phrases that we have in the English language, like "it's raining cats and dogs" and "pull your socks up," that don't actually mean what they mean. It's really useful to be specific in what you're asking them to do and give them one instruction at a time. What we often have a tendency to do is to phrase demands and like questions. So we might say, "Do you want to come down for your tea?" Or "Do you just want to do this for me?" And sometimes that's really confusing. So try and avoid the use of questions and stick to telling them what you're expecting, letting them know really clearly what you want them to do. Finally, allow them time to process the information, knowing that it might just take them a little bit longer to make sense of what you've said to them. So you might want to just leave a pause at the end of each sentence. And our last and probably our most important point is to say what they can do rather than just what they can't do. So for example, if I'm standing here and there's a child next to me who's bouncing a really noisy basketball up and down, if I say to them, "Stop bouncing that basketball," if they're just processing information and maybe not taking in everything that I'm saying, they might just focus on one bit of that sentence, bouncing the basketball or basketball. And actually it might be really difficult then for them to know, even if they do understand what you're saying, well, what do you expect me to do with this instead? Actually, if you say "hold the ball still," you're giving them a better chance of knowing what to do with that. Social stories are another really useful tool that you can use with a child with ASD. They do what they say on the tin, really. So they are a short story that's aimed at communicating information in a really clear, accurate and meaningful way to the child. And they can be used for all sorts of different situations. So we might use social stories to point out the things in a situation that might be obvious to some people, but the child might find difficult to pick up on. So these might be some social rules that we kind of expect them to just know about, to communicate those in a really clear way using a social story. We might use one to prepare a child for something that's going to be new or different, or to go to a place that they've never been before. So we might write them a story about going on holiday, going to an airport, going to a birthday party, for example. They're a really useful tool and they're best when they're personalised for your child. So they use really clear, simple language. They might use some pictures and they have the format of a typical story. A beginning, a middle and an end, a title and some pictures. But the main thing is that they're getting across what your child needs to know and they're helping you to understand your child's perspective and them to understand the context and the situation and the information that they might be missing out on. So here's a good example of just a really short social story. So this might be for a younger child or a child who's used to reading or looking at stories with this amount of information. And this is just a really straightforward story to explain what happens when you go to an airport. So I'll just read it through with you now. I am going on holiday with my family. We will be going on a big plane. We will go to a big airport. We might have to wait in a queue. This is okay. I can look at my books and hold Daddy's hand. I will try to do good waiting with Mummy and Daddy. Mummy and Daddy will be really happy if I do good waiting. So you'll notice in this story that there's some really clear pictures, that the language used is really simple, and it's probably personalised for that child. So it tells them things like what they can do when they're waiting, It tells them who's going to be there. And that's the important thing, that a social story needs to be really supportive. It needs to give the child some information about what to expect and what they can do. And it's reassuring, because new situations, new places can be really anxiety provoking for a child with autism. So this next example is a social story that's written for a slightly older child, or a child who is maybe used to reading or being read stories that are a little bit more wordy and complicated. What you might notice is that there's a bit more text, and that maybe the words that we're using are a little bit more complicated. And I'll just read you through this story now. It's about winning and losing, which is probably a topic that many of you recognise is an area that lots of children find really difficult. So, winning and losing. I like playing games with my sister. When I play games with my sister, I like to win. My sister likes to win too. Most people like to win in games. Winning can make people feel good and happy. I feel happy when I win. Usually there can only be one winner. I don't like it when I lose in games. Most people don't like to lose in games. Losing can make people feel sad, disappointed, or angry. I feel angry when I lose. This is okay. When my sister wins, I think that she has cheated, but everybody wins sometimes. There are things I can try and do if I lose in a game. I can try to take some calm breaths. I can try to talk to my parents about my feelings. I can try and remember that nobody can win every time. I am learning that it's okay for other people to win sometimes. So the aim of this story is to communicate those unwritten social rules about winning and losing in a game that might not be so obvious to a child with autism. It's also letting the child know what they can do, and those are probably things that someone's talked to that child about before. So taking calm breaths, for example, is something that they know what that means, talking to mum and dad about how they feel. And you'll notice again that was fairly typical story format. And the idea of these are that you use them like normal stories, that you might read them with your child, you might read them to your child, or you might just have them around for them to pick up and look at and remind themselves of. So that's just a really brief overview of what a social story is, and a couple of small examples for you. We know that this can be a really useful tool to get across information to a child in a really nice, acceptable and supportive way. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about social stories, or maybe you'd like to try and start using them with your child, we've put up a few useful resources on the screen here. So there's a couple of apps that are free to use where you can build a social story using pictures that you can take on your phone or your tablet. These are really useful for if you need to write a really specific story that might be about something that you can't find a picture of. So for example, if it's a story about how to nicely pet a cat, you might want to take a picture of your actual cat to include in the story. There's a couple of really good books. So Siobhan Timmings is an author. She's a parent of a child with autism, and she's written a series of books over the course of her child's lifetime about all the different stories that she's written for him. So there's a book aimed at younger children who might be kind of that nursery or infant school age. There's books for older children, teenagers, and then young adults. And each book contains a series of stories and some background context about how she did a bit of research and how she found out about what to write the story about. There's also Carol Gray's book. Now, Carol Gray is the founder of Social Stories, so she's written a huge book filled with lots of stories. A lot of these are about day-to-day activities that might be difficult for the child, so kind of to do with daily tasks like washing and dressing, as well as being at school and being in assembly and hearing the school bell ring, things like that. And she talks you through the process of writing a social story. There's always some really useful information on the National Autistic Society website, and they have a designated page covering social stories and comic strip conversations, which is another useful tool that's well worth looking up, particularly for use with older children. And finally, if you'd like to look at some more social stories or find out more about how to write them, take a look at our website. There's lots of examples on there. And also feel free to ask in your next appointment about the Social Stories workshop that we run here at Reigate, where we guide you through the process of writing a social story for your child.
Another useful tool for your toolkit can be visual supports. Some children who have no language use PECs, picture exchange cards, as a means of communication. I think any kind of pictorial support will help any child, irrespective of whether they have language or not, as this is your child's preference. Using visual supports can be a really good way of aiding your child's understanding and also offer some structure. Let's for a minute just have a think of all the visual supports that we use every day. I very much live in an era of I need a paper diary in order to write my list, to get everything down. I can't manage using the online, diaries. So that's a really good visual support for me. If we think about post-it notes, people use them as visual reminders all of the time. If we think about on the roads, we have traffic lights, we have, signs on the road that indicate to us what we need to do. Has anybody put together a piece of furniture from IKEA? There's no words in the instruction manuals these days. It's all very pictorial. So we use, visual supports all of the time in our everyday life. And your child will respond to this style better. So it's really important that we try and tap into that, and it can be really helpful and mean more to them. Here are some examples of visual supports which you may have used before. The now and next model, or first and then, is often used in speech and language with the younger children, and it can be really useful to get children to do an activity. But as it's written down, it's pictorial, it's quite concrete, it can guide them as to what they need to do. An example of this can be first you put your shoes on, then we go outside. Another example, first you have your tea, then you can watch TV. Having it written down, having the picture there means much more to your child, particularly as verbal language they may find more confusing. In clinic, I often have families saying that the morning routine is a nightmare because the child they need to be behind them all of the time in order to get them to do what they need to do. Using a list, or if your child's of an older age, that they're more able to do that, or pictures, but writing it down and providing them with a list can be a really good visual way of getting them to do what you need them to do. In an era of technology, there is an app for everything. So, I'm sure your child will find one out there that they may find useful. The bottom section on the slide is a strip used for toileting, and you may see that in schools and play centres. Again, it's a really good visual use of reminding somebody what they need to do. Here are some more visual supports that can be quite useful, more for older children. Having a menu on your fridge of what you're going to be having for dinner that week can be really helpful. It can also reduce the stress of knowing what to cook for tea and help with your shopping, because you'll have the food in for that meal. That can also follow on with homework diaries and things like that. There's a really good visual aid of particularly children just going to secondary school where they need to be more independent in getting their school bags ready. It can save you a lot of time in the long run, but initially can be a bit time consuming setting it all up, getting pictures of everything. But once you've done it, it can be a really useful tool in getting your child to be independent and getting themselves ready for school. Again, there's apps for everything, and we will put some references to those on the web page. Alexa and Siri can also be a really good use of technology, because you can set reminders up, you can set timers up. And Alexa can give your child a really clear explanation to any questions they might have. So it's a tool that a lot of our parents do use and a lot of our children really like. Children with autism can struggle to predict what might happen, and them not knowing what's going to happen can cause a lot of anxiety. So offering some structure and routine can give them predictability. If we think of an example of maybe going to the supermarket, a lot of children find going to the supermarket really challenging. A, because of the sensory elements, but also how long are we going to be there for? I don't really want to go. So there's lots of elements to it that they find difficult. So by offering them a bit of structure, so giving them some idea of which supermarket you're going to be going to, what you're going to be buying, and how long you're likely to be there, can give them lots of information in order to structure the trip and aid them complying with you and making it as easy as you may be able to make it. I think if you're going to offer that structure, it's really important to stick to that, because if you suddenly decide, oh, I just want to pop to a different shop along the way, that is where you often might get some more difficult behaviours. So I think if you are going to try and encourage your child to, go to the supermarket, be quite strict and rigid with them. And as things evolve, hopefully you might be able to build in a bit of flexibility. So we're just going to explore now some top tips regarding structure and routine. So try to be predictable in your daily routines. Prepare your child for any changes using visual supports. Try and recognise your child's own routines. Talk to others caring for your child to improve consistency. This can prove problematic, particularly for parents that are separated or for grandparents. I think it's really important to recognise that your child needs the same response to whatever behaviour they are doing, as if you're getting different messages. This can cause confusion for your child. Finally, it's really important to schedule and access time for special interests. Here are some other resources that you may also find useful. The National Autistic Society has lots of information on their website. Also, Do to Learn and Twinkle have lots of worksheets that you might be able to print off. And there's also some useful apps, ChoiceWorks and the ASD tools, and we will provide links for them on the website. Okay, let's just bring it all together and summarise visual supports and structure and routine. Visual supports can help your child develop their independence. It enables effective communication and makes expectations clear. They provide structure, which helps reduce anxiety, and it reduces reliance on verbal memory. It also taps into their visual preferences. They can be really useful at times of stress to diffuse a situation, particularly when a child is in meltdown. Often using a visual card can be quite helpful. And finally, visual supports can help your child make sense of the world.
Children with autism often find change hard, and this can include moving from one task or activity to another. This may be due to difficulties in understanding what's happening next, understanding the concepts of time, so for example, how long until an activity ends, or finding it hard to cope with being interrupted. Motivation may also play a role when the current activity is more enjoyable than the activity the child is moving to, or the next activity is less attractive or demanding. Waiting can also be very difficult for children with autism to understand, as it is an abstract concept. They might have lots of questions about waiting, like, why do I have to wait? How long do I have to wait for? Or what shall I do whilst I wait? Warnings and countdowns can help children prepare for endings and changes. Sand timers or sand timer apps are very visual, so the child can see how much time there is left of an activity before it ends, which helps them to prepare for the transition and make it more predictable. For children who are able to tell the time, they may wish to use an analogue or digital clock or a phone timer. Countdown cards are another visual example to show children how many minutes there are left of an activity before it finishes. A wait card can make understanding waiting easier. The idea is to give the child the wait card when they have to wait for something and take it from them when waiting is finished. The wait card can also include some suggestions of what they can do whilst they're waiting, if this would be helpful. We've already talked a little about sensory differences in autism. These differences mean that children with autism may experience over or undersensitivities to the senses. If a child is oversensitive, they will often try to avoid these sensory experiences, whereas if they are undersensitive, they might seek out these experiences. Each child has their own individual profile of sensory needs, and this can change from day to day and over time. You might also find that your child demonstrates greater sensory sensitivities at times of greater stress. It can be helpful to observe how your child responds to different sensory information to work out their preferences. This will help you to think about how you can reduce or increase the amount of sensory information they receive. When children are oversensitive, you might see them putting their hands over their ears, they might prefer to wear hoodies or baseball caps, and they might struggle with seams and labels on clothing. For children who are undersensitive, you might find that they enjoy spinning or rocking, staring at lights or shiny objects, and they might smell or lick objects. So here are some examples of sensory objects. Ear defenders can be helpful for children who struggle in noisy environments, but they should only be used for short periods. Headphones attached to a music player can work similarly to reduce background noise or to increase stimulation. Having a fidget toy, like a fidget spinner or stress ball to fiddle with, can help some children to feel more regulated, particularly during activities where they aren't really moving much, so like during lessons at school or when watching TV. Chewing and sucking is also good for regulation using a chew buddy or chewelry. So the up and down movement of bouncing on a gym ball can be calming for some children who seek movement. There are some videos showing other ways of using a gym ball, which you might want to try with your child, on the Children's Hospital website. The occupational therapy and physiotherapy team have produced some really helpful top tips around managing various sensory issues, which can be found on the same webpage, along with some videos of different techniques and a bite-sized version of the sensory workshop they run. We know that children with autism often find everyday experiences more stressful. With that in mind, it's important that we try to balance the demands we place on them with their level of tolerance. For example, if your child has had a really difficult day at school, their tolerance will likely be much lower than usual, so try to reduce any demands on them at home as far as possible. Equally, if they've had a great day, their tolerance will likely be higher, and it is times like this that you can encourage them to do more. This might mean that sometimes you have to pick your battles and drop things that aren't vital. It can be helpful to think, does it really matter if they... So for example, some things will be non-negotiable, but others can be more flexible. For example, for a child who struggles with dressing and undressing, on low tolerance days, getting changed into their pyjamas to go to bed might be too much for them and lead to a meltdown. It can be helpful if you can be flexible in your expectations. Striking a balance between demands and tolerance can help your child to stay more regulated and avoid meltdowns. A meltdown is an intense response to feeling overwhelmed with a total loss of control over emotions and behaviour. At this point, your child can't express how they feel, and so this is often explosive. Although we do often think of meltdowns as being explosive, it's also important to recognise that some children may shut down and withdraw when they're overwhelmed. This may particularly be the case for girls. Although it might not feel like it, your response to a meltdown can make a huge difference to the outcome. The priority is to keep everyone safe. This might mean leaving the room or redirecting your child to leave the room or go outside or to their bedroom. Try to make the environment safe by removing things that might be thrown or broken, but remember that these things can always be replaced. Drop any demands as far as possible. Your child won't be able to understand or comply, and it is likely that will just increase their anxiety or frustration. Offer comfort or space. For some children, having space will help them to calm quicker, whereas others might want you to stay with them but not say anything. You know your child best. Try to stay calm. Although it can be very difficult when you are feeling stressed or upset, try to stay calm and respond in a calm, reassuring way. Think about your body language, facial expression, tone of voice. This is important as your child might pick up on your emotions and mirror them. Reduce language. We know that when we're really angry or anxious, we can't take in information, and it's the same for your child. During a meltdown, the thinking part of their brain will have shut off and won't be able to process or take in what you're saying. It might be tempting to ask what has upset them or try to reason, but this is unlikely to be successful.